My name is Matt Crane. I work with the Institute for Christian Unity here in Boston. I also work as director of the We Forum. The We Forum is really a big part of my work with the Institute. I just want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about the Institute for Christian Unity. We, as the name suggests, we do a lot of work seeking and desiring to bring the whole church together, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, Evangelical Protestant, Mainline Protestant. And so today, I'm here with Nika Elugardo. Nika is a colleague and friend. She serves as the Director of Applied Research at Emmanuel Gospel Center. And she spoke about a month ago at our second We Forum. And we didn't have a chance to film that We Forum. And I really regretted that because Nika's presentation was outstanding. She spoke on race and racism, and the title of her talk was What Race Isn't and the Kingdom of God. And it was just a tremendous talk. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Nika to share a little bit about how she wants to move forward, and we'll just kind of have this conversation and see how it flows.
When you asked me to come to the We Forum and I realized we were going to be having a conversation with about 30 people, they were likely to include a diverse group of people, but not too many African Americans. And the group was probably going to be mostly middle class Christian. That shaped how I shared the stories. If you're not, a typical white middle class American, just keep in mind that these stories were shared for that audience. And we're walking through to try to help people put on the shoes of someone else whose life they can't really see or imagine. So what I'm going to ask you to do, Matt, to just recreate it. And maybe if you're watching, you can do the same thing. So I'm going to give Matt 3 questions to ponder about the stories and also some roles that he can choose to play. I encourage you, if you're watching, to do this with a partner and have the discussion of the answers to your questions. I'm going to repeat the instructions as though you've never heard them. So I'm going to tell you a story. It's a true story from my life that impacted me that relates to race. And in that story, I'm going to list for you, before I tell the story, some of the key characters in the story. And I'm only going to describe them in terms of their race and their kind of demographic qualities. And then I'd like you to select a person in the story. Select one of those characters. And that character is you as you listen to the story. So you're going to listen to that whole story through the lens of that person. You identify with that person, you empathize with that person, you are that person to the extent that you can imagine that. So as I tell the story, you should be thinking of yourself taking the actions that your character is taking as that person. Then after the story, I'm going to ask you to share 3 things with myself and with the people watching. One is, who was the character that you chose before I told the story? The second question is, what were the feelings that you think your character was experiencing? What were the feelings, maybe some of the thoughts you thought might be going through your head as that character? So that's the second question. And the third question is, what, if any, difference do you think there would have been if you had been in the role that your character played, but as Matt, as yourself, and not as that character? Okay. How would you have felt differently about that same situation? How might you have behaved differently? So the first story is about me, and I'm a little girl around age 8. So you can be an African American girl around age 8 in the 3rd grade in an Ohio elementary school. Another character you might choose is a white principal in his 40s. Okay. You may also choose a white, young, 20-something teacher of the 3rd grade. Okay. Or you can select a little boy who's African American and about 8 years old. Or you can be a little white girl whose family migrated from Appalachia, and she's also 7 or 8 years old, a classmate of mine. Okay?
Okay.
All right. So this is a story set in Hubbard Elementary School, where I attended second and part of the third grade. I was playing on the playground. Are you familiar with tetherball? So that's a game where you have the ball at the end of a rope. And so the little girls used to gather in the playground and play tetherball. And I was part of a group of about 8 or 9 girls who were playing on a particular day. And we were holding a little girl's watch. So this is a white little Appalachian girl who has received a new watch. It's pretty cheap, but it was a real special purchase for her family because they had very little money. And she was so excited about this watch and didn't want to have anything happen to it. So every time she took a turn, she'd have a different girl hold on to the watch for her. Well, of course, by the end of recess, she lost her watch. It had passed through too many hands. And the principal called all of us into his office after recess and lined us up. So there were about 5 or 6 little white girls and 5 or 6 little black girls. But mind you, I actually didn't notice the racial makeup right away. So just a group of us girls went in, and the principal started yelling at us. I mean, he was an angry man, and so it wasn't uncommon for him to yell at students, even though we were small. And he said to us, "I want to know which one of you girls stole this little girl's watch." And we all just said, "Nobody stole the watch. We all just held it for her." We were all looking at each other. What is he talking about? So he points to several of us, you, and you. And he says, "You girls leave the room. Go back to your classes." And I was one of the girls who stayed. So there were about 5 or 6 of us still in the room, and he starts going on and on about how he knows that we stole the watch, one of us stole the watch. You people, he said, have a problem with stealing, and if one of you doesn't confess, you're all going to be in trouble. And so I'm thinking, what does he mean about you people? What is he talking about? And suddenly it hits me that all the girls in the room are black, and all the girls who left were white. Now, before I continue this story, let me tell you, this was a violent school, even though it was an elementary school. I think, in fact, as sometimes Christians say, there might have been a spirit of violence. So I was attacked several times by other students in the school. And beyond that, I was under the impression that the principal became violent with a couple of children. So there was a friend of mine that I had, a little boy, the 8-year-old African-American boy, and we were playing, not together, but near each other in the playground. And he did something against the rules, and somebody reported him, and one of the teachers sent him to the principal's office. And I watched him go into the school building, to the principal's office. But he didn't come back. And we went to class, and we'd been in class for quite some time, and he comes limping into the class, clearly in a lot of pain. And the teacher, now this white 20-something young teacher, she hated me. I just knew she hated me, and she hated him too. And I didn't know why, but she was so mean to some of the kids in the classroom. And I was surprised when she looked at him with so much compassion, because I'd never seen her look at any of us that way. I don't think I was aware until this moment that it was the black kids that she tended to hate. But she looked at the kid and said, "What's the matter with you?" And he said, I fell off the monkey bars." And I thought, that's not true. He went to the principal's office. Well, it turns out, we'd find out later, not at the time that my story is set, but after that time, that little boy had actually been body slammed by the principal and broken his ribs. So he went to the hospital. We knew the next day he'd broken his ribs. The story was that he fell off of the monkey bars, but I think from the teacher's expression, she also knew that that wasn't true. It was the first time I'd ever seen one of my school teachers look frightened. And I remember watching that transgression of emotion on her face, from the original contempt when he's walking in the classroom to the compassion after she realizes he's hurt, and then the fright after he says his reason. And that caused me to believe in that moment, my principal is a scary and violent man. Other children had been hurt when I thought they had been in the principal's office. And so now, if we fast forward from that story back to my story, where I'm standing in front of this man, it's scary that he has sent all of the white kids out of the room and had 6 of us black girls. But before I had a chance to realize that I should be scared, I blurted out, "When you say you people, are you saying that black people steal?" And he didn't like to be interrupted, least of all by black kids. So he sent all of the other little girls out of the room. Now, this man was sadistic, I think. He had a paddle. In those days, you could paddle children. This is in the 70s or right around 1980. You could paddle children, and he kept his paddle in his grandfather clock, where the tick-tocker usually goes. And so in that glass area, there was a paddle hanging instead of the part of the clock that swings. And he said to me, "Go get my paddle," which was his thing. Like, you had to bring the weapon of destruction to him. And I refused, because I was thinking of this little boy and of other little children that had left the office with black eyes and different things like that. And he said, "Get my paddle." And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, if you don't get my paddle, I'm going to call your parents and tell them what a bad kid you're being." And suddenly I had an epiphany, and I realized that if my father knew about this conversation, I'd be saved. My father was a bit of an angry man, especially when it came to race relations, shall we say. And so I said, "That's a good idea. Call my dad, and I'm going to tell him you said that black people steal." And then that was the only time I ever saw my principal look scared. My father was a big man and a young man in those days, in his 20s. And I think my principal may have known that. I'm not sure. In any case, he let me go. And later it came out that he had been abusive and he was fired. But that's the story. So, did I cover all the characters?
I believe you did.
All right.
Yeah.
So, Matt, which character did you choose?
Well, I chose, when I was at the forum, I chose the white principal.
And then I bet you were disappointed
and
that
then,
you had
and then when you shared the story, I regretted choosing the white principal. I chose the white principal because you had mentioned he was in his late 40s and white, and I'm in my late 40s and white. So I thought it'd be very easy for me to identify on some level with that principal. And then when I heard what this principal had done and the nature of the person, I wasn't particularly happy with the choice. But I went with that. And I thought maybe it would be valuable to choose again. But I actually chose this time. I chose the 8-year-old African-American boy.
Okay.
So I chose him.
Okay, so if you're watching, before Matt answers the second question, turn to your partner and just tell them who you chose and maybe why. So Matt, why don't you tell us about today's experience first? So what do you think the African-American boy was feeling or thinking or experiencing in the story? Just your imagination, that's all you can do.
Right. So I think of putting myself in this young boy's shoes and to try and understand as best I can what he would have been experiencing. The two words that come to mind are confusion and fear. And that I think if I'm this young boy, African-American boy, and there's fear because of the power that this principal has over me, and the fear of continuing. I'm sure he was threatened that he had to say that he fell off the monkey bars or he'd get in worse trouble, and I don't even know what those threats were. But so a lot of fear around the power that this principal had, and what the greater trouble that I could get into if I said the truth. And then confusion that to something. So perhaps I or the 8-year-old boy did something in the playground that was wrong, but the confusion over whatever that transgression was and the disproportionate violence that happened to him because of whatever that was that he did, or maybe he didn't do, but whatever it was he was being accused of doing, and this disproportionate punishment and violence. So just confusion. So there's a state of bewilderment, of fear, of confusion. So those are the two really that hit me the hardest: confusion and fear.
And how do you think that differs? And of course, this is the third question, from how you might have experienced that story if you had been yourself.
So if I was myself and the same thing happened to me,
yes,
I think there would still have been a lot of fear, of what was happening, and probably for a lot of the same reasons, I think. And the confusion aspect, though, it's interesting. I think I might still say confusion, but I also might say surprise. Surprise, as a white boy being struck by this, perhaps I would be surprised. I can't say for sure, but perhaps I'd be more surprised at, why is this happening to me? Whereas if I'm an African American boy in this white, where you have the white principle and this kind of white power structure, maybe it wouldn't be surprising because there's a history of this. But so I think maybe confusion, but maybe surprise that as why is this happening? Whereas that might not maybe there was some expectation of this for the African American boy. So maybe surprise.
Right. Okay. Now, if you're watching, take a pause and give your friend an opportunity to answer the same questions. All right. So are you ready for another story? One more story?
Yeah.
Okay. I've got a ton of these, but I'll just pick one.
Yeah.
This one is actually about my father, and my father in this story is about 16, which is 3 or 4 years before I was born. Okay. So you can choose to be a 16-year-old African American boy in the late 1960s in Ohio. You can be his employer, who is a prominent doctor and philanthropist who also owns a ranch where he employs young black men from the city to come and work. You can be a father, a biracial father of the African American boy, who's also a pastor and a believer.
Could you clarify that part? I didn't follow that. Who is that character again?
Who's the parent?
Yeah, the biracial
My
parent.
grandfather.
That's your grandfather.
You might be confused because I don't think I mentioned that he's biracial
Okay.
the last time. So,
Right.
so my grandfather, my father's father.
Okay. Yep.
So he would have been probably in his 30s at that time.
Okay.
Maybe his early 40s.
This is your paternal grandfather.
That's right.
Okay.
Okay. And so the characters again are my father, who's a 16-year-old African American boy in the late 60s. His father, who's a biracial pastor, married to a black woman. You can be the employer, who's a white man, a middle-aged white man, who's a noted philanthropist and doctor, and also a business owner where he employs black boys at a ranch. Or you can be a young white male who is also around 16, 17 years old and is a friend of my father and my father's cousins. Okay? All right. So in this story, my father starts out as a buoyant, mischievous, happy-go-lucky 16-year-old boy in urban Columbus in the late 1960s. And like a lot of boys, he wants a job so that he can have some pocket change at least. And to his delight, his cousins introduce him to a man who's recruiting boys to come and work at a ranch. Now, my dad loves animals, especially horses. He's had some exposure to horses through extended family in Michigan. And he also loves the idea of having a stable job that summer. And he loves the idea of working with his older cousins. They're all between 17 and 18 years old, and his older brother is part of this gang as well. So the four or five of them take this job together, and they share a car, and they drive out to the ranch, and they work at the ranch. Now, my dad's boss took a particular liking to him. His name was Dr. Plotnick. And Dr. Plotnick really took my dad under his wing. And my dad felt, I don't know if he felt close to him, but I think he was a little honored to be recognized for his quick wit and for his hard work. And so he had, professionally speaking, a close relationship with his boss. One day, one of their friends, enter white 16, 17-year-old boy, redheaded guy, comes up to them and hesitantly says, "Hey, guys, I don't know why, but my uncle wants you to go in and get the $2,000 saddle that's in there and bring it to him." They're confused, why should we go touch a saddle that we're never supposed to touch and go to a part of the barn where we're never supposed to go?
Okay.
Are you trying to get us in trouble? But they really trust this kid, and he looks a little off, but they trust him. So anyway, he convinces them. They go in, they get the saddle. He said, go all in together. It was very suspicious. You know, it's not a movie, so it's unclear why.
Okay.
They just went with it. They were young boys. They went in, they got the saddle, but when they came out, they were surrounded by white men from the Ku Klux Klan carrying rifles. And the men threatened to shoot them unless they followed their instructions.
Okay.
So what happened earlier is that one of my father's cousins had developed a crush, a mutual crush, on one of the white girls who rode at the ranch.
Okay.
And someone had spotted them kissing on top of one of the hills. And that person had reported this to Dr. Plotnick. And it turns out Dr. Plotnick was a member of the KKK. In addition to being a noteworthy doctor and a well-known philanthropist. And he gathered a group of men, and they decided to teach my dad and his cousins a lesson. And so this is where they are now. They're surrounded by men with rifles, and their friend is nowhere to be seen. And the men tell them, well, looks like you're stealing our saddle, and that's an expensive saddle. That qualifies as grand larceny. And the boys didn't respond. They were quiet because they were smart enough to know there was nothing they could say in that situation and that they had been set up. The oldest cousin told them, don't go anywhere. So the men said, no, if you run, you might have a chance to get away. Tell you what, we'll count down to 20, from 20. And if you run fast, you might get away before we start shooting. And the oldest cousin said, no, don't run, because they can legally shoot us in the back if it looks like we were trying to steal something expensive from their property. So just stay here no matter what happens. And my dad didn't like that. He was the first one that was about to take off. He really thought he could outrun the bullets. But he listened to his older cousin, and as a result, they didn't get shot to death, but they got beaten pretty badly. And all of the boys were hospitalized for a minimum of 2 weeks. My father was the only one whose parents, my father and his brother, were the only one whose parents decided to press charges. They were all threatened that if they attempted to press charges, that charges would be pressed against their sons. My grandparents prayed, and my grandfather said, you know, the Lord will, justice will prevail, and the Lord will protect us. We're going to do what's right. And so they filed charges, and those charges were dismissed. They were dropped. In the story, in the late 1960s, it ends basically that way. My father heals up after a couple of weeks. He comes out a different boy. He's a man when he comes out. And he's a man that's deeply wounded and deeply angry, not just at Dr. Plotnick, but at white people and at a system of injustice. And my dad would spend really a couple of decades unwinding and unwrapping that anger and healing from it. It turns out, though, that Dr. Plotnick was a trafficker in drugs and weapons, and he was recruiting boys on his ranch to move drugs and weapons for him. And my dad discovered that later because he ended up in some unsavory business, and he met some folks that had been recruited by Dr. Plotnick. My father became angrier over the years because Dr. Plotnick went sort of untouched by the law. It turns out, however, that for most of those couple of decades, the FBI was investigating Dr. Plotnick. And while they were never able to get him on drug charges, they were able to get him on weapons trafficking and other charges. And he went to jail, he lost his practice, he lost his wife. He contracted a terrible illness in prison and died there. And the day he died, it was on the local news. And I remember my father crying. And so I was about 15 when that happened, so it must have been a good 20 years after the incident that my father endured. And I remember my father crying as he watched the news and saying, I don't believe I wasted so much anger and so much pain on this man because I thought justice wasn't going to be done. And all the while, God's justice was being done. what I came to realize, being a woman that was raised by my father, is that my race doesn't define my identity. So my ethnicity and my blackness is very important to me, and it's a core part of my experience. But especially as a woman of God, my identity is determined by Jesus. And that knowledge provided me with a kind of a strength to stand as Nika and to continuously discover who that was in ways that couldn't be determined by the racist people who were impacting my life. So I could have told you stories of a guidance counselor who refused to give me the test application for the Math Level 2 test because she didn't think kids like me should be applying to higher end schools. All kinds of things where I knew that I had the right and power to fight back because the construct that she was putting on me because of my race was not mine and was not me. As I got older, however, and became consciously aware that race is a construct, I was still angry at white people and others for being not only clueless, but very often racist. And when they weren't blatantly racist, certainly ignorant and racist behaving. And I came to realize that if my stories were invisible to them, their stories must be invisible to me. And at some point I had to swallow a very bitter pill as a believer and realize that forgiveness wasn't just a matter of saying, well, Christ has forgiven me, so I forgive others for the atrocities of them and their community. It was also a matter of love, and love looking like an acceptance. And so one of the advantages of listening to stories in this way is that we try to understand on the heart level and on the thought level what it might be like to be in a story that is invisible to us.
Why I'm so grateful that we have this time, that we've made this time to put this on film to share your stories. When you shared at the forum, and as you told me you were going to do it in stories as opposed to kind of a lecture presentation, I thought, well, that's interesting. It's different than what I envisioned. But so you presented through your stories, and it was just it was clear that everyone that came to the forum that night was moved by it and was engaged by it, which is again really why I was kicking myself that we hadn't put it on film that night. And so why I'm so grateful to Brant for putting it on film now, and for you kind of take the time to come down here. Because the reason, this is so valuable, and the stories you're sharing are so valuable on many different levels. But the one that hits me the most, and it hit me that night, and I made a comment during the comment time, or the question and answer time about this, was that it related to making the invisible visible. And as a white person, and this is, for a lot of us now here, and all of us on some level probably, we're fresh on the heels of Ferguson. And it has been fascinating to me to watch the responses, my own visceral responses, the responses of the African American community, the minority community, the white community, who we identified with, Michael Brown, or the police officer, whose name I forget at the moment, but and remember seeing in the news the support that the police officer received from the white, the suburban St. Louis community, which was understandable. As a white person, I could understand, well, maybe he was attacked, and perhaps the officer wasn't at fault or as much at fault as some were saying. And then there was the black community and the minority community that was just enraged by this and the riots, and so for me, I had my own internal struggles trying to sort out. On an intellectual level, I understand racism, even as I have my own fears and biases and bigotry that I work through on levels. But there was confusion for me in sorting it out. I can understand racism intellectually, but as you told your stories, I really want everybody to listen to your stories. And even I spoke to you before. I said, could we go to other places and could you share those stories? Because for me, and I hope for people watching this, one of the great empathic things that can happen is that as I hear the stories of your father, your story, your father's story, and then you see what happens in Ferguson. If my story is your father's story, how could I react other than how the African American community in Ferguson reacted? I mean, the distrust because of my life experience, because of my stories, there would be an understandable, an unavoidable distrust and anger and maybe even rage toward white authority. And as you shared your stories, I don't know that I got it as clearly in my whole life in the way I got it that night as I listened to your stories. And because my stories as a white person, as a white male, are different. And some that's good, some that's not good. But I got it in a way that I hadn't gotten it before as I listened to your stories that night. And so I saw Ferguson in a different light than the way I had been seeing it. And so for me, there's just great value in this making what's invisible visible.